academic session. The academic partners for our second session are Alembic. I request our chairpersons for session 1, Dr. Chandrasekhar and Dr. Mekhla, to kindly chair the second session as well. Over to you, ma'am and sir.
Yeah, I think I will call Dr. Veena Ramchandran. She's our senior fellowship student who is about to take the exam in a month or so of her final qualifying examination. I will request her to go ahead with this interesting case which we managed in our center.
Good evening, everyone. I'll just be sharing my screen now. Yeah. Good evening, one and all. So today I'll be presenting a case of a 48-year-old female who was referred to us in 2016 with history of 6 weeks of amenorrhea with twin pregnancies, as she was detected to be anti-SSB positive. She had history of recurrent pregnancy loss. This pregnancy she had conceived by IVF with the help of a donor embryo. She was also diagnosed to be APLA positive. She had anti-cardiolipin antibody IgM positivity. She had undergone 4 cycles of IVF prior, out of which 3 had not progressed beyond 8 weeks of gestation. The patient was already on tablet Thyronorm as prescribed by the treating gynecologist.
Ma'am, can you please go to the slide share, ma'am? The full screen.
1 second.
It's in the full screen. Just move the cursor, ma'am.
Move the cursor. I think
Yeah, the
cursor.
play button. Can you?
Okay, 1 second. I cannot see my cursor. That's the problem. Okay, I think it's okay now.
It's on the play button, ma'am. Just move the cursor.
Now is it okay?
Yeah. Please go ahead.
Yeah, fine. So she was already started on tablet Thyronorm as prescribed by her treating gynecologist. However, her anti-thyroid antibodies, which were done prior to the visit to our center, were within the normal range. We had started the patient on hydroxychloroquine at a dose of 200 milligrams twice a day. And she was also started on injection low molecular weight heparin at a dose of 40 milligrams daily and low dose aspirin, considering the anti-phospholipid antibody positivity. However, this pregnancy also did not progress beyond 8 weeks, as there was no cardiac activity which was appreciated at 8 weeks. She further went on to undergo her 5th and 6th cycles of IVF in the year 2017 to 2018, which did not progress beyond 4th week of gestation. She developed multiple skin rashes, progressed to have bleeding PV, and lost the pregnancy. She was advised to start steroid at a dosage of 7.5 milligrams 5 days prior to the embryo transfer from the 6th IVF cycle, along with the other medications, basically low molecular weight heparin, low dose aspirin, and hydroxychloroquine, which she was already taking. In July 2018, the patient underwent her 7th cycle of IVF. She was started on prednisolone 5 days prior to the IVF, low molecular weight heparin, and she was continuously on hydroxychloroquine. However, this pregnancy was a chemical pregnancy, as the doubling of beta HCG was not appreciated. Throughout this follow-up period, she had a fluctuating value of the inflammatory parameters. Because of this recurrent pregnancy loss and pregnancy loss even after trial with steroids, low molecular weight heparin, and low dose aspirin, we suggested the patient for injection rituximab, as it was almost behaving like a refractory antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. She was also explained that the pregnancy could not be planned until 6 months post the injections of rituximab. Since she agreed, we went ahead and did a TB quantiferon, which was positive. So the patient was started on rifampicin as well as isoniazid 1 month prior to the injection rituximab. She received the 2 doses of rituximab in May and June of 2019 and continued her anti-tubercular drugs for 6 months post the injection. A repeat workup was done in end of 2019, where we saw that there was a switch of antibodies from SSB to SMRNP positivity. Also, there was an additional strong beta-2 glycoprotein IgM positivity along with the anti-cardiolipin IgM. The anti-SSB was negative this time. She underwent embryo transfer in March 2020, and patient was started with steroid 5 days prior to the embryo transfer. Patient was also on hydroxychloroquine, low molecular weight heparin throughout this pregnancy. This pregnancy was uneventful. She had a successful pregnancy and delivered a baby boy at 36 weeks by LSCS in October 2020. This is just to summarize the journey of our patient. She is a middle-aged female in a non-consanguineous marriage with no significant family history, who had history of 3 IVFs at 8 weeks of gestation with anti-SSP positivity, anti-cardiolipin antibody IgM positivity. These 3 IVFs were in the year 2014 to 2016. She presented to us post the 4th IVF with twin pregnancies at 6th week, but no progression of pregnancy beyond 8 weeks in 2016. 5th IVF was a failure, which was in 2017. 6th IVF also was a failure despite adding the patient on steroids, low molecular weight heparin, and being on hydroxychloroquine, which was in 2018. 7th IVF with the patient being on steroids and the other drugs was a chemical pregnancy. She was suggested rituximab. She took the rituximab in mid 2019. We did a reworkup, which showed a switch in her profile and an additional beta-2 glycoprotein positivity. She underwent the embryo transfer, 8th embryo transfer in March 2020 and had a successful pregnancy. This graph shows the inflammatory parameters, how it has fluctuated throughout her last pregnancy. December 2019 was when we reworked her up, where her ESR and CRP was within the normal range. She underwent the embryo transfer, and post the embryo transfer, when her pregnancy was detected positive, we did her inflammatory parameters, which showed a slight increase in the CRP. Considering the fact that this was a precious pregnancy and her age, we had started her on a dose of 7.5 milligrams of Visalone 5 days prior to the ET, but we increased the dosage to 10 milligrams twice a day so that the inflammatory parameters would be maintained and the pregnancy would be would continue. Throughout, at every monthly interval, we have monitored her, we have followed her inflammatory parameters. Since there was the fluctuation was within the permitted gestational age values, we did not have to fluctuate or increase titrate the dosages of the low molecular weight heparin or the steroid throughout the pregnancy. However, this suggests that it is very important that along with the gynecological follow-up throughout her pregnancy, it is important that such patients are followed up at regular intervals by the treating rheumatologist so that we can titrate the dosage of the medications as per the requirement and make sure that we have a safe and continue the pregnancy. So we diagnosed her to have undifferentiated connective tissue disease with refractory antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. She did come back to us in November with history of low back pain post-delivery, and it persisted. So we went ahead and did an X-ray of the vertebrae, which showed a compression fracture at the lower thoracic vertebrae, which was secondary to the osteoporosis, as she has been exposed to a prolonged period of low molecular weight heparin and steroids for the continuation of pregnancy. This is one of the complications that we can anticipate and we have seen in our patient. Looking a little at the literature which is available, as mentioned by all the speakers earlier, we know that inflammatory rheumatic diseases like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis and other inflammatory arthropathies definitely affects the woman of a childbearing age, and management of the pregnancy in women with rheumatic diseases can be affected by various factors. Active disease is a major contributing factor for adverse pregnancy outcomes. Prescription of many DMARDs is complicated by the safety concerns that is associated, and evidence-based guidelines are unable to provide reliable evidence-based recommendations of all the drugs. Specific pregnancy concerns exist for various conditions that should be considered when discussing pregnancy planning and disease management with the patient. This tabular column shows the various autoimmune rheumatic diseases which can affect disease activity, can be affected by pregnancy, and pregnancy can be affected by the disease activity, where we see most concerning diseases being rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, Sjogren's, and antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. Persistent positivity for the antiphospholipid antibodies identifies individuals at risk for various adverse pregnancy outcomes. The lupus anticoagulant positivity seems to be the strongest predictor for the adverse pregnancy outcomes in APS, and triple positivity for all three tests indicates especially high risk of pregnancy complications and thrombosis. In 2019, a survey which was conducted with the data from the European Registry on Obstetric Antiphospholipid Antibody Syndrome, which studied about 1,000 women with obstetric antiphospholipid syndrome, showed that the live birth rate was only 49.6% without treatment. However, it rose up to 85% with the recommended treatment regimen, and almost up to 72.4% with other regimens, including low dose of aspirin or low molecular weight heparin. Recurrent miscarriages were observed before 10 weeks of gestation in about 27%, fetal loss in 17%, and stillbirth in 18.5%. This survey also reported early preeclampsia and early IUGR in 16.1% of the cases which were studied. Looking at some of the articles which are available, this is the first patient which is reported in literature, published in 2008, who was having recurrent IVF failures. She was a case of antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, received her rituximab. Post 6 months, when she was reevaluated, the antibodies turned negative and she continued to have a normal pregnancy. We have seen in literature that the mainline treatment of antiphospholipid antibody syndrome surrounds anticoagulation. However, now there is a lot of literature suggestive of usage of anti-B cell therapy and hydroxychloroquine in management of these syndromes, as they are predominantly the etiopathogenesis surrounding autoantibodies, which is causing the trouble. Earlier in reproductive immunology, research has always focused on T cell responses to the paternal antigens and the tolerance mechanism supporting fetal well-being, and there was very less research concerning B cells activity in or supporting the pregnancy process. We know there have been supportive features of B cell activity, like release of cytokine interleukin 10, which helps in progression of pregnancy. But also the production of these autoantibodies suggests that the B cells can also be detrimental, or the activity of these B cells can be detrimental, thus suggesting that anti-B cell therapy can be sometimes useful for treatment of such patients. With this, I would like to thank Chandrasekhar sir for having given me an opportunity to present today. Thank you very much, everyone.
I think it was a very, very interesting case to hear of, and at the end, in infertility, it's very common to see these kind of cases. And as you very well re-emphasized, I think it's not only important to follow up with the gynecologist, but also with the immunologist, so that both of them run parallelly. And ultimately, it would be a much safer option for the patient.
Sure.
I too had a similar case like this, around 46 years. Again, sir is only treating her, but she's yet to deliver.
I think one thing which is very critical here is, I always keep saying that the pregnancy is a dynamic process. It doesn't start and ends in the same manner. So we need to understand the dynamism of the pregnancy and the disease process, which we need to keep a tab through, because basically what really happens is we think that once the things roll in, it's going to roll in the right direction. That's not what really happens, because the previous experience with that patient clearly says that the patient rolled in a wrong direction. That's where the pregnancy didn't really happen or didn't go in the right directions. So, there are a few things which I always say, that the inflammation as we perceive is something which is a very crucial things which plays a role in the very beginning of the pregnancy to the very end of the pregnancy. You need a good amount of inflammation for the labor to happen. You need a moderate to optimum inflammation for the implantation to occur. So, best way I try to explain to the patients or the relatives is that it's like a cooking. If you have less flame, you'll end up in cooking a bad dish again. If you have too much of flame, again you'll end up in losing the cooking what you have tried to work with. So that's how the inflammation really works. You need to slowly manipulate the inflammation to be an optimum point wherein you neither undercook nor you overcook the processes that occurs. It needs a lot of working up. It is still an exploratory areas in the pregnancy. It's one of the area where especially the new researchers, new coming postgraduates, people who are really keen to work on should put their mind so that some solution comes. Probably you may discover a Nobel Prize processes in the process of this research, because that's one of the area which really need to be explored and make us to understand how really the pregnancy and the immune system interacts at that placental surface. I would love commentary from both Dr. Sundari, Dr. Chaitra, if Dr. Renuka, if anybody is in the would like to contribute on the discussion. Yes, madam, Dr. Sundari.
Yeah, it's really a challenging case, I think. We had the same case, as I put it up, 6 IVF pregnancy losses. But I don't know, at that time we were not using this rituximab. Now the new molecule has come in to treat. That's what I was mentioning in my talk, the refractory antiphospholipid syndrome, where they give a double dose, that is a therapeutic dose of heparin is tried in them. I don't know, Chandrasekhar must tell that. Otherwise, they say probably even that, if it doesn't work, immunoglobulin, they say. But I don't think anywhere it is mentioned in our literature about the monoclonal antibody being used for refractory Apla syndrome.
Yeah, I mean, it's more seen in the rheumatology textbooks than the obstetric textbook.
Yeah, in our books it has not come yet, because the latest also I was reading about Apla. Whatever comes latest I'll be reading, but in our literature it is not there. But this is I think a new thing I learned today. Refractory. So far in my tenure, I have only one case of refractory alpha. She was a young girl and she was a diabetic also, type 2 diabetic, and 3 pregnancy losses. She came to us and I think we put her on heparin and all. I don't think you remember that. And after that, the husband didn't agree for further. That pregnancy also we lost in spite of heparin, like the same this pregnancy, but she was spontaneously conceiving. But the diabetes came up very well, and then she was uncontrolled diabetes she had. Then I was encouraging her for one more pregnancy where we thought we would do as a refractory Apla, but they didn't come back and they just said, we can't afford any more, madam. We don't want to continue this. They said, that's one patient where I really failed to conceive. I mean, convince them to have one more pregnancy. That is one refractory I have seen. All other cases have really responded to our treatment. That's the only case I saw. In spite of it, it was not successful. But I think we will see once or twice, the first 2 pregnancies, in spite of heparin, they don't continue. There are 2 or 3 cases, probably the antibody load, or I don't know what it is. Then the next time when you again try them with the double dose, I had one girl, staff nurse from our own institute. She had the same problem. Then I had to go for a therapeutic dose. And then, of course, in spite of it, she used to have a threatened miscarriages, but I used to keep my fingers crossed. Somehow she continued and she had a successful outcome. 2 pregnancies. These are the very little of the refractory RPL I have experienced.
No, I mean, see, I think what is very critical in all these autoantibodies are, especially when we come to the terms of antiphospholipid antibodies, I think one should go into the review that I with Dr. Professor R.N. Mishra have written in our IJRCI. See, the antiphospholipid's pathogenicity, we call it as 2-hit theories. In a sense, for APLA to be effectively cause a trouble, there is a 2 push is required. Push number 1 should be disruption in the endothelium. Push number 2 is the antibody's pathogenicity. If both the push coincides, that's the only point where the pathological or a pathogenic process occurs. So that's how the process is. So suppose if the patient is or a person is lucky, if the first push doesn't come, in spite of she being having a high titers of antibodies, things may not happen in a wrong direction. The patient may continue to have a fruitful pregnancy, even without even using or adding aspirin as well as heparin. If you see, sometime you see a patient who is APLA positive, 2 pregnancy loss, 1 in between went up to the 9th month or sometime delivered, and then next 2 goes for a toss again. So that one small interval where she could successfully sail through was the point where the antibody titers were not either high or it was not having a second push for it to produce an problem. See, in all autoantibodies, that is the major problem which we have to work with. That's why any of the epidemiological studies, any of the database studies will certainly make us to miss this particular thing. That's one of the major controversy that I was trying to discuss when we are talking about ANA. So the ANAs, why that most of the literature says ANA is not useful to do the test. And again, it's also the same problem when it comes with the natural killer cells. The natural killer cells, normal range is very high. If you have seen it, we range from 120 to 240. The range is so high. So in that, actually, sometimes the functionality could be very good even at 70, 100. So the what we call that borderline are sometimes which misses you when you compare with 100 patients, whether it is going to be useful or whether it's going to be a real task process. That's what is the real challenge for us. That's why we are trying to work up from the statistics and research method, how to use these kind of case by case studies and how to interpret for the best outcome workup when you are going to give the recommendations. I mean those are all the what we can say gray areas of medical science, especially evidence-based medicine analytics. It takes time for us, all entire scientific community to work towards it and get that in place.
There is a question, I think, for Dr. Veena regarding the dosage.
Ma'am, we had given the patient regular dosage at 500 milligrams at the first sitting, and then after 2 weeks, we had given her another 500 milligrams of rituximab.
I think we can conclude. I think it's almost dinner time. Yes.
Thank Dr. Veena for presenting a very interesting case, which was an icing on the cake for the academic feast on reproductive immunology that we had today. I also thank the chairpersons for conducting a very knowledgeable session. I take this opportunity to thank all the panelists, participants, and digital team and academic partners for making today's sessions a grand success. We also request your presence for tomorrow's program, that is day 2, 20th of December 2020, with the theme Infections and Rheumatology, which starts at 10 a.m. The link will be intimated prior to the scheduled time. Thank you one and all. Good night.
Good night. Thank you. Thanks, madam.
Team.
Thanks.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Very well.
Thank you.